Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Dirrick Butler. I'm the founder and executive director of Project OneTen. So excited that y'all are joining us again today. It's been a few months. I started this and was like, let's do an episode every few months. And here we are 5 months later. So it's all good. But our Keeping It 110 series is an opportunity for me to sit down and talk with just some dope people in the city who are doing really great work, whether it's directly with students or kind of on the periphery, right? And really leading us in conversations around belonging, identity, youth development, activism, all the great work that we know is needed to push our city and our country further in a more equitable direction. Really excited to be here today with my friend Diego. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It is a pleasure, as always, and this is awesome. This is what a cool opportunity.
I am so excited to be spending today talking about your new book. Our paths crossed, oh my goodness,
5 years
ago. We were both Surge Fellows here in Chicago. What do you remember about 2019? It was a different world.
It was.
Pre-pandemic. What was...
And we had no idea.
Right.
I mean, I remember it being such a transformative experience because we were meeting every month. They were treating us really well, but also challenging us. At least I felt very challenged and had my mind open and had to think about things in ways that I had taken for granted, especially with regard to public education. I think I went into it with just some really strong, highly opinionated views, and I really had to question those and rethink my whole orientation, which then, of course, in August, it would have been August of 19, we wrapped up, graduated. And then just a few months later, the planet changed forever.
Definitely. It was almost like, you learned all this stuff, you got all this amazing, knowledge and were challenged. And then you kind of like went into isolation, just you with your thoughts. So what am I doing?
What is happening?
What's happening? What is my role? Which I feel like kind of was like a blessing in a way, right?
If we have to find any kind of like lining from it, yes, for sure. Like that ability to like step away and then almost again reassess, like had to really think about like my orientation and disposition toward these topics, but now let me put it into practice.
Right.
Now if I can't be in the classroom with students and we're doing it via Zoom, how can we make it so that people are getting what they need while recognizing how weird and strange and scary, like the emotions that came into the classroom. In some ways, I think they surfaced more via Zoom than they would have in the classroom in person in some ways, right? Because we just had to be hyper conscious of that. And I wonder, again, like one of those linings maybe that came out of that, I hesitate to call it a silver lining, but it was a thing like that we can take away, is putting those feelings and those emotions and the emotional responses to educational experiences front and center, as opposed to pretending like that's like just another thing to deal with or like work around. Like actually that's core to a student's, and I would argue as a faculty, my own experience too in the classroom.
So faculty, where are you at? What do you do? And how has your work changed since this big shift, right?
So I teach at Truman College, which is actually right down the street from where we are right now. I've been there for a long time. I started teaching part-time at the city colleges in 2010, like right out of grad school, fresh back to Chicagoland, Chicago proper. And was fortunate enough to start teaching English composition and some first-year seminar courses, and that's what I teach now. I've been teaching full-time since 2014, so been there a while, And there's two big changes that have really forced me to continue to rethink and think about how I show up in the classroom, which is, number one, I got hired at a time when our enrollment was really high. For complicated reasons, the 2008-2009 financial crash had kind of just happened and was just recovering from that. Turns out when that happens, people go back to school. So we had lots of students, lots of new students, folks who had not been to any kind of college or higher education. And so I took it very seriously. I took it upon myself to help these folks through what is a baffling labyrinthine experience. Higher education, it's very confusing and it's very inconsistent from institution to institution. And so I took a lot of pride in that. Fast forward then to the pandemic, and we have fewer students now, even we're almost 5 years on from like the height of the pandemic, and the biggest challenges now is convincing students to come back in person.
Yeah.
Because we showed them, and we had to adapt, we had to adjust. We showed them that you can get an education from a distance, right, remotely.
Yeah.
And I do believe that if they come in person and we have that learning community in real life, there are benefits that are tangible and intangible that you just don't get via Zoom.
Yeah.
But like, that's a hard sell to students who now we have kind of acclimated them to, like, you wake up, you open up your device, now you're in class. Whereas I have to make the case, like, if you get on that bus and then that train and then the bus again and you be in person, it's worth it.
Right.
Like, that's a hard sell.
Yeah.
But we shall see how the tides turn. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
You know?
It's so interesting. I'm curious. So I'm an adjunct professor at Loyola, and I was teaching kind of during that time as well, where things were virtual and then hybrid. But at Loyola, right, things quickly shifted, right? We were back in person, right? Like, all my classes right now are in person. We have the option, of course, the flexibility if needed to do things virtually. I'm curious, like, is that a very specific city college kind of experience around, like, there's an option or a choice, or just curious as to how that is kind of manifesting itself.
Yeah. On the one hand, I almost envy, I want to call it authoritarian, not in a necessarily bad way in that sense, but private universities, they can make decisions, and that's what it is,
Yeah.
And in some ways that is very useful. In other ways, we have to acknowledge that city colleges, one of the great benefits to, I think, both the students and anybody who teaches there, or anyone who works there will probably say, is it's an open access institution.
Yeah.
Literally anybody can enroll. And I think that's beautiful. You get mixes of students, and the demographics are just so incredibly diverse. And then one of the challenges, perhaps, is that Truman College can operate with a certain amount of autonomy. We can do what we need to do for our community, for our students. But the truth is that we will have folks coming from Hyde Park, from the West Side, from Rogers Park. And we're also connected to the other 6 city colleges, as well as the city of Chicago. It's like, I'm a city employee, and that comes with lots of perks and also a certain sense of pride. Like, I really pride myself on being a public employee, We're also entangled with the city of Chicago for all that that entails.
Yeah.
And so sometimes things move very slowly, excruciatingly slowly. And so I think that even our local administration would like to just bring everybody back to campus. But the reality is, for many students in Chicago, if the choice is between taking an in-person class and waiting a semester or finding a different institution, a different college or university that can serve them remotely, they'll probably do that for now.
Yeah.
And we'll see how that changes,
Yeah, no, I really like that kind of, as you say, like, open access, right? Like, you can access it anywhere, because I imagine there's a gamut of types of students, right? Like, folks who are, getting, going to work and then logging in after work, right? Like,
or at work. For how many back rooms or storage rooms I've seen on Zoom, I'm like, you're sure this is above board? Okay.
Right. I mean, you have, parents, right? Students who are, potentially using this as an opportunity before transitioning to, a 4-year university. I mean, students who are getting additional credit hours for work situations, right? So it's interesting, right, of thinking about all those different dynamics and being able to make decisions that are like, we want this to be the least restrictive education for folks, where they can kind of like get it anywhere, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Moving into, like, we were joking earlier about, like, me not being a English expert. I mean, I won't say English, but, like, the class being in English, I taught history, right? So while, writing and all the things are important in history, this will be an interesting conversation as we get into more in depth around your work.
Yeah.
But yeah, share with us your new book.
Yeah.
How did this idea come about?
Yeah.
And yeah, what are you hoping, I guess, like, resonates with people?
For sure. Let me just pop this direct to camera. There we go. I'm glad that you have, I'm grateful that you have a copy of the book. I still carry with me this is an advanced review copy. So, like, it's not as polished. You can kind of tell it's poor quality. The reason I carry it around, I still read from it, and I will continue to until it disintegrates, is because this is the first physical, like, artifact version of it that I received from the publishers. And it's very special to me. And it tripped me out to see it in real life because you ask about the process. And the poems themselves have lived with me. One of them, The Skin, is one of the shorter poems in the book. I found a draft of that in my email from 2008.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, oh boy, this is really time for these poems to be in the world. But
was it the same? Had it shifted? Did it?
It was very, very close.
Okay.
And it was actually a poem that I read when I visited Chicago during grad school. A magazine, I was very fortunate, a magazine called Granta published another one of my pieces and flew me out to Chicago for a reading for like their launch event. And it was my first taste of like literary, like fancy literary life. I was like, whoa, they flew me out. They paid me a little bit. Here I am. And then you fast forward, right, 15 years to when the book finally comes out. So it was a very long process. The idea came from 10, 12, 14 years of just writing poetry and trying to discover both who I am and what I'm about and what I like to do. In some ways, it's a version of my thesis. I went to grad school at Rutgers in Newark, and my thesis advisor, Rigoberto Gonzalez, helped me understand that at the time, I was writing these two different kinds of poems. And I had divided them up into two different like books, blue books and brown books. And the brown books were all about ethnic identity and being Paraguayan and being Latino and those kinds of questions. Some of the history was in there too. The blue books were more interested in language, and so kind of more inventive, more experimental. Some of the ones in the book that you'll see now, not many of them actually were in the thesis, but they kind of look different on the page. So they're kind of spaced out in a funny way. And so what my thesis advisor, Rigoberto, said, he was like, look, I see what you're doing. Like, I get it. Combine them. Because this is not your story. Your story isn't half this, half that. Your story is all of it together. And this is like during our, final semester, my final meeting with him, getting advisement on the thesis. And he's essentially saying, change the whole thing. It's like, okay. So I did. Then I spent the next 10 years or whatever. And I will say by like 2017 or 2018, I think I had most of the poems together. And I even had a couple opportunities, like close calls with maybe publishing it. But at that time, this would have been pre-search. This would have been before I became a father. So many of the poems at the time were interested in inheritance and lineage and heritage and the things that we get from our ancestors, essentially. My dad being from Paraguay and the languages that he did and did not pass on to me, and kind of wrestling with that.
Yeah.
But then when my child was born, for me as a person, and then also for the speakers of the poems, it just, this whole other dimension opens up where it's like, not just, it doesn't end with the speaker or with the poet. Now it's, well, what am I passing on or not passing on to my child? What am I enabling her to do or not to do, not to access? And I'm so grateful for, I'm grateful for my child, obviously, but also for waiting. Like, I'm glad that the book didn't come out before then because it wouldn't have been this book, and this book doesn't exist without her in the world. And I had to wait. I think if I try to convince Diego of 10 years ago or even 5 years ago of that, he wouldn't be having none of that. He'd be like, no, publish it now.
Yeah.
But I think it's a better book. I hope so. At least it's a better representation of like who I am as a person, as a poet.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. You talked about like the brown and the blue books, right? Like, I want to take us back in time, right? So, I'm an Illinois transplant, originally from Dallas, Texas, right? Moved to Chicago and have lived here 10 years. I've traveled to Springfield. I've, traveled to DeKalb, Illinois, and totally understand past Chicago is a very different place, right? Yeah. So tell us about where you grew up, right? Tell us about what you remember about that time. And I want to use that same metaphor of like brown and blue books. Was that similar for your growing up, right? Keeping your two kind of like identities separate. Was that notion of combining them new for you? I want to
that's a good question, because when I think about that time, so I was born in Bloomington Normal, grew up there. Illinois State University is there. Illinois Wesleyan is there. And State Farm is there, importantly.
Yes.
My dad came over from Paraguay as a high school student, actually. So he was 17 years old. And he initially stayed with a host family in Gridley, Illinois, which is just one little farm town outside, the small town of Bloomington Normal. And ended up coming back a couple times, went to college at Illinois Wesleyan and stayed. And worked at State Farm, which is why I mentioned State Farm. My dad worked there for 37 years and then retired.
mostly everyone who lives in Bloomington, like either works there, knows someone that works there. Like,
if it's not the person themselves or a family member, it's like a close friend or family member, and that's in the minority. Most people have like someone in their family works or had worked at State Farm.
Yeah.
And I will say, like, I'm grateful for that stability. Growing up, we had at least growing up as a kid, we had a stable household. You know, it was like things were predictable in a lot of ways, and that has kind of rubbed off on me. I find myself gravitating towards things that are more predictable, more stable, more reliable, as opposed to taking big risks, which, you know, sometimes there's a trade-off for that. But I will say, growing up, I did not grow up with a Spanish-speaking community or a Latino community at all. There certainly is in Bloomington Normal. There are many Mexican immigrants, Mexican Americans, Chicanos, Chicanas, and some Central American folks as well. But we did not live on that part of, like, that side of town. Maybe not so much as Chicago, but Bloomington Normal is pretty segregated. Like, you know, people who are white live over here, black folks over there, Latinos tend to live in another part of the city.
Yeah.
And so my brothers and I have two younger brothers. We're all very close in age. We grew up in a neighborhood where we were pretty much the only brown kids in the neighborhood until maybe later when State Farm, so folks from India started to immigrate more commonly. And eventually we're like, hey, there's another person of color.
Yeah.
But by then I was kind of getting into high school and college. And so it was very odd, though, to grow up with my dad, who would call home, call back to Paraguay and speak in Spanish, obviously. And also they speak an indigenous language they're called Guarani. And hearing him, he'd have to speak kind of loud because the connection was bad. It's not like today. It was not a cell phone. This is a landline.
Right.
You punch in like the calling card, you're shouting on the phone. And so that was a core memory. It's my dad shouting Guarani into the phone, not because he's angry, just because the connection's very poor.
Can you hear me?
Exactly. And so I had all that with me.
Yeah.
And I will never forget going to middle school. And it would have been 7th grade. My dad came to speak to a Spanish class, and I was very proud of that because there hadn't been any overlap. Like, though it had been very separate. Like, it was something my brothers and my family and I did was go to Paraguay and then come back. Like, I had that memory, just that part of my identity. It was strengthened every few years. We'd go down and spend about a month in Paraguay. But then we'd be immersed in just cornfields and very white, town.
Yeah. And
so, they were very separate until my dad was going to come in 7th grade, come to Spanish class and just talk about being from Paraguay. I was very proud of that. I was like, oh, cool. Finally, like, overlap.
Yeah.
And my dad seemed to be, pleased with the experience. I saw him afterward and he was like happy about it. And I remember a peer came up afterwards, kind of like in a joking way with a smile on his face, and made a comment about my dad having dirt floors when he grew up. But it wasn't delivered in a spirit of like, that's so dope. Like, he came from that. It was more of like isn't that funny and not even unique? Isn't that a novelty? Like almost like a circus act. And I remember even then thinking like, this is rubbing me the wrong way. I can't put my finger on it, but what is going on? And unfortunately for me, that kind of continued through high school, even into college. It really wasn't until, is this true? It really wasn't until grad school that I had a teacher who could share some of my ethnic and racial identities. And it was Rigoberto. And I think about that a lot because I know, I don't know if your experience is similar, but talking with folks in Chicago, it tends to be less often the case that they had to wait many years and years and years to have a teacher who looked like them or had a similar experience. And I think that's like, thank God that people can have, like, especially young people can have that experience earlier.
Yeah.
They shouldn't have to wait until they're a grown person to finally have an instructor who's like, oh, you know what I'm talking about. I don't have to explain the whole rigmarole,
Yeah.
And so a lot of that it's not peripheral. That's central to the poems that I ended up writing. And I came to poetry very early in life, like really middle school is when I started to kind of understand like lyrics and lyricism and imagery.
Yeah.
And then you had asked earlier sort of the question of like where the project for the book came from. And a lot of it was inevitable. Like, it was me just kind of sort through this stuff and then relying on mentors, relying on other folks who could share. Rigoberto's Mexican American. It's not the same as being Paraguayan, but it's a lot different to someone who grew up in Central Illinois and didn't experience any of that,
Totally. Yeah. In my, so I teach philosophy of education. We, one of the big questions that we kind of talk about is, the first time you felt seen in the classroom. Of course, you know, we go through the classics, philosophy texts, but the second half of the class, we really kind of delve into like, yes, this philosophy stuff, but like, how does it show up in the classroom, right? And, you know, my classroom is very reflective of the teachers that we have in America, right? Mostly white, mostly women. So experiences don't diverge a lot, right? But to your question earlier, right, I think about growing up in schools and being able to share in the classroom as a Black male, my experiences in school. And to your point, I want to say I've had maybe 2 Black male teachers. I was fortunate enough to have quite a few Black women teachers. But to your point, there is something different, right? When you connect with that teacher who's, to your point, it may not be like full identity, but like it's something that's different and like that's close. And it's like, oh, you see me and I feel like I can show up differently, like in this space. I'm curious, like in growing up in Bloomington, right, having that moment where a classmate kind of was mentioning something about your dad and your culture in a way that like maybe didn't sit right. Did you ever have a moment where you felt maybe that like you had to choose like who am I, Diego? Like, do I need to fit in this culture here in Bloomington? Do I hold on to this very potent culture of my dad? And yeah, I'm curious like how that showed up for you.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because I'm just now realizing that it was right around that same time, maybe a year later. It was right around that same time in middle school when I started playing basketball for my church. And my church was on the other side of town, and there's a lot of Mexican Americans and Mexicans who attended. They had Spanish mass. My dad would often, I think once a month, he would translate the mass in real time, which was cool to see occasionally. Like I didn't appreciate it at the time. At the time, I was just like, I gotta go to church again? We were just there. But now thinking back on that, I'm like, that's actually pretty special that my dad like did that or could do that. Yeah. And it was there playing basketball for St. Mary's, Bloomington, that there were these 2 Mexican dudes who I'm like realizing this right now, showed me in a way that felt like a peer, not so much like intergenerationally, but as a peer, what it could mean to be Latino, like as a model. Like they just showed up in their language and their demeanor and their dress and their cultural heritage they bring with them in a different way. And I was interested in that. And they were very kind, very open. We had very different lives. Yeah. But like they just treated me like another Latino, Diego Báez. It's like you're part of the crew, obviously. And I don't know, you know, I'm realizing like as we talk right now, that I don't think I ever consciously decide like, oh, I want to be more like them, or I'm going to reject that and like retreat into whiteness or whatever. Yeah. But it was, I think then it was one of the first times when I realized like there are other ways that I can be.
Gotcha.
And I'm very grateful for that because I had a great time. I don't know if I was ever any good at basketball. Our team was not very good at all, but I enjoyed it a great deal. It was like a lot of fun, you know?
Yeah.
And now it's interesting because, so sure, being Latino, but also from Paraguay, there's this weird like parallax that happens because Paraguayans, very few of them are coming up on foot or driving or taking La Bestia, the train up. Most Paraguayans who end up in this country fly over because the distance, you know, and then they land. And in a lot of ways, that's a luxury. Like you're getting off a plane, at least that much is easier for sure. Yeah. But then you show up in a country where already Latinos are a minoritized population. But then within Latinidad in the US, Paraguayans, I believe last count that I saw was about 28,000. So 28,000 of us. That's like not even that's like a small town. If we're all in one place. Yeah. And I went most of my life without seeing any other Paraguayans like in real like in person in the US. Yeah. As my dad, his networks extended, he met more of them. And so eventually he had parties. So when I was in high school, college, he would have these big get-togethers with what I thought were a lot of Paraguayans. There was like maybe a dozen of them. And that's like everyone in the Midwest was there. And growing up now, after the book came out, I am so fortunate because I connected via social media with 4 or 5 now other Paraguayan American writers.
Oh, cool.
Who I had no idea existed before that. And it was only because the book started getting some attention or just getting public, some publicity, that folks reached out to me and I was able to reciprocate. And we had a Zoom call a couple weeks ago where it was 4 of us on the Zoom call, and they had already kind of known each other, but not directly. And to come together for like an hour with folks who I didn't know existed, first of all, like 6 months ago, didn't know they existed. Certainly didn't expect a Paraguayan American writing community.
Yeah.
But already it's grown from like nobody to like 6 or 7 people already.
Cool.
And it's very special. And I do, I feel a little bit of responsibility, I guess, to share their work too, to amplify their voices because there's so few of us. It's like we gotta,
Yeah, totally. It's so interesting you mentioned, right, that like this time frame was middle school, right? So, Project OneTen, our work is really centered around supporting boys of color transition from 8th grade to high school. And when we talk to parents, right, we think of that age, 13, 14, 15, is where students really begin to shift from kind of like parent approval, parent kind of like, well, what do you think? To really beginning to shift to an external validation, right? Your friends at schools, the basketball team that you're a part of. So being able to see, right, like people that have similar culture can show you ways to really marry those identities and cultures together, I can imagine was monumental at that age and really kind of stuck with you, right? And it's really like why our work exists, right? Because that age, that period in time is so important.
Yeah.
So in your book, right, it really delves into your personal journey, right? In reading it, seeing kind of the differences in chapters 1, 2, and 3, and like the flow of it. I'm curious, like, do you have a favorite poem, a favorite story that's told, and what was kind of the inspiration behind that?
Yeah. So the one that had come to my mind is because we were talking earlier about sort of storytelling and why a book of poems versus like a memoir or an autobiography or something. And I do use a lot of prose forms. I like writing prose poetry because you can kind of get away with both. Like you can write a poem, but you don't have to really worry about line breaks or stanzas or really even rhyme or rhythm, not so much. But then also the prose doesn't have to be perfectly grammatical. You can kind of play with punctuation a bit. And so I like to combine kind of the best of both worlds into these prose poems. And in some of the poems, some of this was conscious and others of it I realized kind of after the fact, but was for certain experiences, particularly those around, like you say, like the turning the bend between like childhood into young adulthood. When we all, I think everyone does go through this experience of like looking less like up maybe vertically at maybe our parents or guardians or family members and more outwards to the rest of the world and our peers. That shift, it can be confusing sometimes. And it's easy for me as like an old person now to be dismissive. I'm not, but to be dismissive of like, oh, no, your peers, like they don't know. Like I know because I've been through it. But that's not true. That's not true, Like the things that our peers do and value and say and believe, that informs a whole generation. And that becomes like then the way that things are.
Yep.
And so one of the poems in the book is, or a lot of the poems that are prose, the prose poem format, some of those experiences felt closed off to me, or they felt almost foreign in a way. And so I used the prose format to try to just focus on the feelings of either being in the car with my primos when we were all younger, going from the capital city of Asuncion to the village outside the small town my dad is from, Villarrica. And that is a defining feature of like my memory and my time in Paraguay is being in the backseat of these cars with our cousins or primas, because we didn't speak Spanish very well. They certainly didn't know English at the time, but just that camaraderie and like the body language and like making up our own like mix of English and Spanish. And it's wild, man, because I'm thinking about it right now. I read the poems. Those memories are like, they live like right here, like so close. we're all old now. Like I was looking at a picture of my primo Juan Pablo. He's got gray hair like me. He's all grown, but I'm like in the book he's like a 12-year-old. He's like a 10-year-old in the book.
Yeah.
And so there's like a weird distancing, and part of me, like a big part of me, doesn't want to lose those memories. Part of that's why it's in the book, so totally. I can revisit them. But then the other part of me, I think in the future, I haven't gotten there yet, but as we grow up, as we mature and age, there are just different relationships, right? And so I don't know. I think this is true for a lot of young people in Chicago is they have family in other states or other countries. And I just have to recognize that it was a privilege for me to be able to visit my family in Paraguay every 3 years or so. Mm-hmm. Like I know because I've worked with students who they haven't seen their immediate family in years and years. Yeah. And if they're able to travel back, or if they're able to go to this, another state, like lots of students have, especially grandparents in the South. Mm-hmm. And it's shocking to me how infrequently they're able to visit. It shouldn't be shocking because economic realities, but it also makes me, those are the times when I need to recognize like what I'm doing is good and it's within my capacity, but also like, where are the institutions to like help these students? We talk about like field trips or field excursions or travel abroad. Like maybe that's important, but also what if we connected them with their family or help bring their family here for a trip or a visit or something? Like, there's so many other ways to strengthen those bonds that I feel like educational systems and institutions they don't have answers for. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think that's so like in hearing your story, what I guess excites me most is just like that opportunity that you did have, right? Yeah. To like consistently have, experiencing Illinois, but then also traveling to kind of view and feel and see your cousins and your dad's folks and be connected to that culture in a way that probably allowed you to not really grapple in that struggle as much, right? Versus when it's something that's just so far away, intangible, you hear about it, but you don't really know. And it's like, well, that part of me I'm not really like connected with, but like you were very connected to it. Yeah.
And I didn't realize that until relatively like surprisingly recently, because I've been talking with some folks about the poems and about the book, and it's been very eye-opening to just revisit that gratitude that I did take it for granted. My brothers and I, if anything, we complained about the trips because it was like, it's a long plane ride overnight. Right. But then I look back on it now and I'm just like so grateful for that. And speaking of kind of extending that outwards, like I do what I can to bring I will say it now, I cherish those memories and I cherish Paraguay as a home, like a place that feels like home, even if I don't always belong there. Yeah. But the way that I cherish that, I bring that now to especially the first year students that I work with, because so many of their experiences, they don't align one-to-one, but they're very close, or like they have a place that feels like home, even if they haven't been there in a while. And again, it was actually right around pandemic time when I started to incorporate that into the actual teaching, into the actual curriculum. Like, why am I asking students to give a presentation about like their major? Like they know it's probably going to change. Like that's not that most important thing. Yeah. The more important things are like, where'd they come from? How do they feel about that? And how do they bring that into them, like show up with that as well? Yeah. And it's surprise, surprise. It's yielded way more interesting conversations, students who are more invested, and
No, I want to go back to something you said around like, how do we build that like, not just cultural identity, but just self-identity, right? Like within young people, the work that we do at Project OneTen is creating kind of a space, right? Where students can begin to think about that, right? Yeah. Because it's not really something that exists in schools, right? Oftentimes, we ask students to strip themselves of things outside of school to be able to fit in and to pass the agenda of whatever needs to happen in the school building. But to your point, I would argue those are the things that like, we just had a conversation in my class about like schooling versus education, which was a conversation we had in Surge, right? Like when we think about education, those are the conversations that like are so enriching and allow students to really begin to kind of see themselves in a way that allows them to engage in the world very differently than kind of in this peg of like, okay, here's your role, here's your thing. Did you pass this test? Great, right? But it's like, who are you? How do you show up? Let's talk about like your cultural history and lineage and I don't know. That just reminded me of those conversations and how do we create spaces like that in schools?
Yeah, you have to be intentional, really, because like you say that I remember that conversation about schooling versus education because it opened my mind as when I was a young person. I really liked school. I enjoyed the structure. Part of that's personality. Like I enjoyed the structure, the predictability, almost the rituals of it. Yeah. But then a lot of it also is cultural, right? Where I grew up. I guess one of the benefits of being in a small town is most of the public schools were relatively well funded, or at least more equitably funded. There wasn't as big of a differences between the neighborhoods, but I benefited from that. Like I was able to enjoy my time there. But then when we had that conversation during Surge, and I think I had to really reevaluate, well, like, wait a minute, in what ways, what memories do I have from schooling, where it's really just teaching me to like kind of go along to get along or whatever, versus the truly educational experiences where education, I love this little bit of etymology for you. Education comes from root words which mean to like go outside or to break open or to move away from something. Whereas entertainment, I'm thinking about this because so much of, especially now when teachers are competing with various forms of entertainment that are with students all the time, entertainment means, well, it comes from roots which mean to keep within, to hold inside. And you think about it, like, I'm not on TikTok often, but whenever I have, it's hard to get away because TikTok, it just keeps you in there. It's very entertaining. Yeah. How educational is it though, right? I mean, it's not maybe supposed to be educational, but in our classrooms, where is the balance between just keeping students occupied and just like moving along from A to B versus cracking them open and asking them to ask these deeper questions about themselves and the world? That those are the educational experiences that lead us out into a bigger picture of ourselves and our understanding of what can even be, you know?
Yeah. Wow. I didn't know that. I'm sitting here like, wow, to like open up, right? I could go deep into like all the articles we read in my like philosophy of education class, but yeah, a lot of that, is around how do we bring those like experiences and cultural stories into the classroom as opposed to asking students to kind of strip those things at the door, right? So you kind of talked a little bit about it, but why a book of poetry, right? As opposed to, anyone who knows me knows I love a good memoir. I love fiction. Not a big nonfiction person. So I gravitated a lot more to the pieces that were a little bit more narrative based. But I'm curious, right? Like why a book of poetry and not, your typical kind of like memoir? Yeah,
for sure. Yeah. And like you say, so many of the poems are narrative. Like there's a story kind of that runs throughout the book itself. For me, and I remember this very well, it was middle school. And again, not surprising. Middle school is a time, right, when we start to just rethink who we are, who we can be, what we're into, what we're about, versus maybe what we have been encouraged to be about or whatever, right? And so for me, I remember two very distinct influences that it's problematic but also interesting. So when I was in 7th grade, I was becoming to be more interested in poetry because of what I was seeing and what I was reading. And I will say this was a time when I felt seen, was that the kinds of reading we were doing, most of it was like canonical white, mostly dead white people. Yeah. But I will say that some of the particular pieces and authors that I was exposed to helped me understand that there's possibility. So for example, Edgar Allan Poe is one. Old dead white guy, right? But very weird old white guy, in that he was writing stuff that was closer to sci-fi and like fantasy or even like horror than stuffy poetry that we often encounter. And I remember it very well, reading Edgar Allan Poe in 7th grade, and this is the nerd in me, but like tracking where the rhyme schemes were, showing me that he does some wild stuff with rhyme, where it's not just end rhyme or like mixing up the end rhymes. He also does a lot of internal rhymes where if you track it, there's like they're all over the place. The pattern of that really appealed to me, and it just blew my mind. I was like, whoa, he like planned this all out, and it tells a story, and it makes sense, and it just got me very excited. It was the same year, maybe even that same term, I encountered Eminem. And so, in seventh grade, what are you, like 11, 12 in seventh grade? Maybe shouldn't have been listening to all of that uncensored, but some mixed messages, and problematic in its own right. But I can't deny that was an influence on me. And hearing the wordplay, the humor. Yeah. I mean, some of it's problematic, but there's other that's more benign. But even just the sense of like character, like Eminem, Marshall Mathers brings a character to the work. He wouldn't deny that. And I was very intrigued by both of those together. Edgar Allan Poe and Eminem, like encountering them at the same time, just made me interested in the possibilities of, yes, telling stories, but doing so in a way that is either a little nonlinear or more rhythmic, or just gives me the space to break up a story. Because a story, even memoir, they're telling a story, full blocks of prose, big paragraphs. With the poem, you can be more sparse, right? And so one of the things that I don't do as much in the book as I maybe will in the future, which is playing with the space on the page, moving words across or aligning it differently. Yeah. And for me, like those formative experiences, and I'm so grateful for them in middle school, they never went away, and they just continue to. And that's, I think at one point, my parents maybe thought it was to my detriment, but hey, look, here we are, we made it. Because I was so interested in like studying English. That's what I went to college for, studied poetry. My father, who came from Paraguay, studied math in a new country with limited English and managed to like make a life for himself. Wow. I can only imagine what it was like for him to see his American-born son, his little Americano, studying English, the language he was raised with. I think about that a lot, actually. But like, we made it work, Poppy, right? And even to today, like I wish there were more opportunities for me to bring the creative, like the truly creative writing into my classrooms, because of this goes back to what we had been talking about, just with the way sort of city colleges kind of works, is there's not as many opportunities for me to teach the creative writing as I hope there will be in the future. Yeah. But where I can, I try to bring in things that I find useful for my own creative process into the classroom. So we'll do in-class writing time, just free writing time, where it's like, there's no agenda here. It's like, whatever you write, that's the point. The point is the process, not the product. Yeah. And even like, that took me until relatively recently to appreciate process together with product or process over product, even in my composition classes, where it's, I literally said this on Friday morning during my English 2 class, like research writing class. I asked sort of flippantly, I was like, how many are going to remember this paper that you wrote? How many are going to remember in 5 years, 10 years, what the topic of your paper was? Probably very few of you. But what I hope you will remember, take with you, are some of these coping strategies, some of these planning exercises, some of your own disposition to getting the work done and exploring your own interests. I hope that is what you do remember, or like these experiences in the classroom. And I hope they do. I guess we'll find out. Yeah. Checking with them in 10 years.
Right. Yeah. No, the process is so important. When we think about, I can only imagine, right, writing this, pulling these pieces, reflecting on poems from 2008 that were in your email was a bit healing. Yeah. Right? Yeah. How, when we think about young people who are grappling with kind of like their identity and reconciling different parts of themselves, how, in reflecting on your process, right? Yeah. Like, how can young people tap into that in a similar kind of healing fashion? Yeah. Writing, whether it's poetry, whether it's like narrative, whether it's like, what I'm curious, like, how can that become a practice for young people?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because I think that often requires going beyond sort of the classroom curriculum, as great as it may be. Yeah, it often requires going beyond what maybe our family is interested in doing, right? Maybe it's ironic, I'm not sure, but I don't come from a family of like readers and writers. Like, we have, I think even still at my dad's house, just the one bookshelf, and most of it's like Christian literature, which is fine. It's got its place. It's all good. Right. But it's not poems, Yeah. So I will say that I think something that can be helpful for young people is to find a model and a community. So a model for the kinds of people they want to be or are, or the kind of work they want to do. I can just think of one in particular. I mean, I hope that in some ways, I know there are other Paraguayan Americans out there who maybe will pick up my book and be like, oh my God, this is an option? Like, I had no idea. Yeah. I know that in Chicago, because I've heard this from many people. So Erica Sanchez is a Chicago-based poet and writer, brilliant. And I know because I've heard, especially younger women, talk about how reading her novel changed their life because they were able to see themselves in the characters. And not only do they see themselves, this author is from Chicago. And so like, well, from Cicero, but Cicero, Chicago. Yeah. And she did a lot of events in town. And like, I remember going to her launch party for Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter at the Mexican American Art Museum in Pilsen. And it was packed. I mean, like hundreds of people were there. And she had written a book of poetry before that, and then this novel. Like it clearly resonated with folks. Yeah. And I guarantee you, so many people in that room were not only there because they were a fan, because they saw her as a model. They realized that's what they want to do too. Yeah. They want to like write about their experiences. And so that's one. And then also is like the community piece. So I remember when I was a little bit older, I would have been like a sophomore in high school, second year in high school. I was really into film. And my younger brother was too, so that was fun. We'd like take the camcorder and do whatever. But I took a class at Columbia College downtown. It was for high school students. And I'm so glad I did because I was able to make my own short film and I learned a lot about it. I tell you what though, like I don't do anything with film now. I don't make movies. I don't write scripts. It's not what I'm into. But I value those experiences so much because it gave me like a structured way to explore an interest. And I think very fondly I used to do a lot of storyboarding, and it kind of brought together like storytelling with sketching, with thinking cinematically. And I don't know how that has or hasn't shown up in the poems or in my life now, but I hope that my child will benefit from these. I think in another generation, those experiences that I had might have been called sort of like pointless or fruitless. Like, where did they actually go? What came of it? The product, nothing.
Yeah.
Or like some poorly made, student film. The process, though, that made me learn things about myself.
Totally.
And I hope that I'm able to share that with my child too. Like, if she wants to go do some whack thing that I'm like, I don't understand, but pursue your passion. I hope I can like encourage that. You know?
Totally. I love the correlation between like rap, hip hop, and poetry, right? Because while poetry may not be something that like, everyone resonates with, most folks want to be a rapper, right? Or the students that we work with, right? We're inundated with that in our culture, which is great. And as you were talking, I'm just like, wow, there are so many connections, right? Because, I think of the different type of, rappers that I listen to. It is very story based and very like, to your point, like bringing up different characters that like are telling stories through different perspectives. And a lot of times, not all the time, it is based on personal experience, right? There is some sprinkles that they put on it to make it a little bit more exciting. But I see our young people want to engage in that culture. And I think bringing those two together, like this is creative writing. This is poetry, right? It is, people perform poetry, right? But I think rap is a very different type of performative art.
And there's a lot of like persona building that can come with hip hop especially, because I wonder, part of me wants to encourage, aspiring rappers or aspiring lyricists to try out different genres almost, right? Like I feel like we look at, and I actually overheard someone talking about the disadvantages that Gen Z has when so much of their experiences with media and culture and music especially, it comes through the screen and it comes fully edited, fully curated, fully polished. Even like SoundCloud rappers or whatever, and they see these examples and they're like, oh my God, like this is so good first time. And the truth is like, no.
Right.
Like there's so much time and energy and planning that goes behind things that look slick and like off the cuff. And a friend of mine I heard her talking about this experience where Gen Z, they just think everything has to come out like perfectly put together. And she benefited from seeing, she was a dancer or is a dancer. She benefited from seeing her mentors fail and fall and get injured. And she went through that process herself to learn that that's part of it. And I hope that especially now that young people don't get frustrated if they put up their, they put up their song or whatever, and it gets 3 plays. That doesn't mean anything actually. All that means is there's more opportunities, right?
Yep. I love it. in kind of, performing, would love, we talked a little bit about your favorite poem. Is there a poem that you would want to share with us? It's always interesting to hear a writer read or perform their work because, in my head, I'm reading it how I would read it, right? But as you said, like you do play around a lot with like, it's not just like type, enter. There's a lot of different spacings. Like there's like, short sentences, then like long. So I'm just always curious, like in your head when you wrote this, how does this sound?
Right.
I don't know. Is there a piece that you would want to read as we close?
Yeah, definitely. Let me choose one. And I will say that's one of my favorite things to do as an audience member or a listener of poetry is to have the text I love to have the text in front of me and then also be able to hear how the poet reads it.
Yeah.
Because and this is another reason I read from the advanced review copy, there are changes, like edits that I didn't get to or I missed or whatever. But like if I've got this one in front of me and I'm reading from it, well, I can change whatever I want.
Right, exactly.
And I remember like that was something when I listened to poets too, if I happen to have the text in front of me, I love to see where they edit their work as they're reading it, because it's like, oh, you're not actually done with that yet, like you're still working on it. That's cool. I think I'll read a poem from early in the book called Lengua, and this is one of the memory poems. It's a prose poem. It's on page 8, and I think the only thing that is maybe some important context for the poem is that it was kind of the speaker of the poem here. This one aligns pretty closely with factual reality. So speaker is basically me, a younger version of me, probably when I was 10, 11, 12, 13 or so. And lengua, some folks will know, is a Spanish word that means language, but also means tongue, like the actual body part. And so the poem was written for the occasion of the grandfather's, the abuelo's passing. So the abuelo has passed away, and the speaker is at this dinner, this sort of memorial dinner to commemorate the passing of the abuelo, and kind of grappling with the intergenerational linkages or now missing links, right? And so this is called Lengua. Pink meat sizzles on grates of mortar bricks and metal brackets. Blood sausage, shanks, intestines, lengua, a word for language, loved by my father, red from corralling young calves with abuelo, smoky, dark now fat around the edges, my father, who ate river fish fresh this morning, who snapped photographs as my uncles slaughtered dinner at dawn. To hear him speak, English at least, to hear him speak of unboned eel and rows of chorizo, but for steak pollo, the porcine screams, the parrots cackle, they mock us and sound human. To hear him speak his native tongue at the table, like the only time I heard him in public, Toastmasters 97, 9 or 10 at the time, and mortified, alive now as we lay abuelo to rest, alive as Orion deep in purple skies, mis primos trained on tiny limes to slice and squeeze and pick moss from the bower, from the head, everybody bow. In Spanish, of course, a toast he makes, a toast I don't. Thunderheads roll in, ash disperses in the breeze. Hot orange coals, cold orange cola. Meester, el perro, snaps up scraps when cousins or primas or tia, his sister, my mother, serves tongue to my father, his favorite. Fat drips from the grill, flames in the fire snake up this gristle. Father, grace this meal.
I love it. As you were reading and I'm looking, I'm like, I don't know that I would have read that in the same because it's all commas and like, it's like one long memory, but very descriptive, right? Like really taking you like to that place. So thank you so much for sharing that.
My pleasure.
I don't know. Was there anything else about this piece that you wanted to share?
I think the one thing that's really, I guess right now resonating with me based on our conversation is just thinking about my own relationship with my father and how that has changed. And for anybody, any student, that's going to be different, maybe parent to parent or ancestor to ancestor, family member to family member. But again, I'm so grateful that I was able to spend that time in Paraguay where my abuelo and abuela spoke no English. We did our best, but I'm so grateful to have that connection. And if there were anything I could wish for, it would be more time with them in the past, or just to be more, I guess it's impossibly more grateful, but just to continue to cherish that. some of us have complicated relationships with our family members, especially with parents. And one thing that I'm trying to grapple with in that poem in particular is sort of I wouldn't call it fraught, but complicated relationship with some of the other poems also speak to kind of frustrations with not being taught Spanish by the father figure there. And at some ways, like that's worth holding on to change, but in other ways, we have to let it go. You know what I mean? Like for me as a person now, I can't begrudge my father for not teaching us Spanish. He had his reasons and he had his frustrations himself. I can only accept that as part of the story.
Yeah.
And like I have to continue to tell that story. You know what I mean? So.
Yep. Awesome, Diego. Thank you so much. So tell us where we can get this book if folks want to read more. Yeah.
So the best thing you can do for me or for your community is to go into the nearest indie bookstore, request a copy of Yaguareté White, and they may have it. That'd be a nice surprise. They may not. But like that, the sense of community and what these bookstores can do for their neighborhoods, it's so much more than what Amazon could do, or even ordering from the press. Please go into the bookstore, ask for it. Also reach out. Like I'm a friendly person. I like to connect. I've been getting some like very surprising and lovely messages from folks through social media, and I do my best to respond within 48 hours.
Love it. Where can they find you?
Yep. So I'm on Instagram. I think primarily is the best place. Profe Báez. It's sleek. It's cooler. I don't know.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, man. This was
Seriously.
awesome. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm just excited to see just you kind of in this reemergence. I mean, out here sharing your story, like this amazing book, traveling the country. It's been awesome to see. So thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Cool.